Netflix's Squid Game took the world by storm with its first season. People flocked to watch it due to the hype and stayed because of the content. In many ways, the show truly changed the understanding of the term K-drama, which until then had a very restricted meaning. In addition to opening the doors to a fascinating industry, Squid Game raised a lot of difficult-to-answer questions that went beyond the fictional matter of the show. And now, when the second season is out, these questions have become more relevant. Does possessing unimaginable wealth really blur the lines of ethics to the point where human lives become pawns in the literal sense? With great power comes great responsibility. Or does power just bring a greater affliction for evil? One of the reasons why Squid Game was shut down a couple of times before it was finally aired is because the show draws upon a horrific real-life incident that had happened in South Korea in the 1980s. If there's one thing you need to know about the Korean government, it's that they have a history of hushing up events that can tarnish the polished image the country so desperately tries to uphold. Be it the glitz and the glamour of the K-pop industry, which hides innumerable instances of abuse, or the prolific world of K-dramas, which almost always focuses on the sunny side of things, while famous actors indulge in illegal acts on the sidelines. And just like that, your current favorite Korean show is actually a reflection of something that South Korea has tried to suppress for years. A project of social cleansing that trapped thousands of people in concentration camps, killing over 500 and leaving innumerable others with lifelong trauma. This is the unfortunate tale of the events that, in part, could have inspired Squid Game. The dark fact about Brothers Home, or Hyunjae Bokjiwan. Before we get into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. What inspired Squid Game's concept? Director Hwang Dong-hyuk has never mentioned the Brothers Home incident as the inspiration for his show. Instead, he has spoken about another unfortunate incident that inspired him to create the show, and this was the SsangYong Motor Company labor strikes of 2009. The company was a car manufacturer that went through financial ruin, and in the process, laid off over 2,500 workers, which was almost 40% of its workforce. This started a 77-day occupation of the factory by enraged workers, which resulted in extremely violent clashes between the protesters and the riot police. The protesters, armed with steel rods and slingshots, faced a huge police force, equipped with tasers and rubber bullets. The factory site was turned into a battlefield, and the strike left a black mark in the history of the labor struggle in South Korea. In the years following the strike, over 30 suicides and deaths were attributed to being direct results of the struggle. Many workers faced legal battles beyond their means, severe psychological distress, and complete financial downfall. The conflict was not just limited to employees who were laid off and the police force trying to calm them. It extended beyond and truly mirrored how the lives of common people didn't matter to the uber-rich. The struggles of poor and middle-class people in an economy that's always in favor of the wealthy is what Hwang Dong-hyuk took away from the incident, and it deeply affected him. The central theme of Squid Game is that anyone can fall to the bottom of the financial ladder humans are constantly trying to scale, and once they do, they're at the mercy of those who have money and power. The depiction of the life and death in a controlled environment, as portrayed in the show, mirrors the struggles of the workers during the strike, since they were fighting for their survival. The director has expressly mentioned the SsangYong incident as the inspiration behind the show, but many fans agree that he could have willfully left out the horrific crimes of the Brothers Home welfare home, which may have well been another inspiration. Ultimately, the conversation boils down to how significant the value of human lives can become in an environment where the rich and powerful control the entire narrative. And if the SsangYong strike showed this in part, the incident of Brothers Home really brings it home. What happened at Brothers Home? The Brothers Home was an internment facility and officially a welfare home located in the city of Busan in South Korea, operating between the 1970s and 80s. Dubbed as nothing short of a concentration camp, it witnessed some of the worst human rights violations in the history of the country, with many news outlets nicknaming it as the Auschwitz of Korea. When South Korea was reeling from the effects of the devastating Korean War in the 1950s, efforts were made to clean up the image of the country and project its progressiveness to the rest of the world. President Park Chung-hee, one of the most controversial figures in South Korean history, was among the first to suggest a social cleansing that would rid the country of symbols of disorder and vagrancy, basically to present the country as prim and proper. All the unwanted elements of society would need to be gotten rid of. Policies were made to detain vagrants throughout the 1960s and early 1970s. Major cities like Seoul, Busan, and Gwangju started constructing facilities for the detention of vagrants, and on the surface, policies framed promised social rehabilitation for the vagrants, which would include training and other programs that would help the vagrants become responsible members of society. Unfortunately, that's where the good part ends. In practice, there was no intention on the part of the government to actually rehabilitate these people. Starting in 1975, the South Korean Ministry of Home Affairs announced the formation of vagrant patrol teams, which would round up vagrants from all parts of the country and send them to these detention centers. Of course, they played hard and loose with the definition of the term vagrant. The authorities basically brought in anyone and everyone they wanted from the streets, which included old people, actual vagrants, disabled folks, orphan kids, and even children who had parents and guardians. Numerous acts of the government gave a legal basis to police and other authorities to be the deciding force behind determining who was a vagrant and who needed aid and was under insufficient supervision. Starting out as an orphan in 1975, Brothers Home became Busan's first vagrant detention center. Similar ones sprung up in different cities and were mostly privately owned and received enormous amounts of grants from the government for general maintenance. Moreover, police forces were rewarded generously for purifying the streets of vagrants and sending them to these facilities. Inmates at Brothers Home were used as slave labor at construction sites, factories, and farms. They were given no payment for their services and were used as disposable tools. In addition to the brutal work they would have to perform, many of them were subjected to sexual slavery as well. Hundreds of people died over the years the institution was in power, being unable to handle the inhumane conditions and torture. These efforts were largely to ensure that the country would have a sleek and polished look ahead of the 1986 Asian Games and the 1988 Olympics, events that would gather the attention of the international community towards South Korea. And in an effort to look flawless, the government joined hands with some very powerful people to commit one of the worst crimes in the history of South Korea. Were children victims at Brothers Home? Due to the unchecked send-offs to the facility, where anyone who could not produce valid identification documents was transported as a vagrant, children suffered greatly. Kids as young as 8 years old were picked up from the streets, sent to Brothers Home, and brutalized. Han Jong-sun was 8 years old when he and his sister were taken by a police officer to a bus, clearly against their wishes. When they protested, they were violently beaten for being too loud. For Han and his sister, this was the beginning of a 3-year-long nightmare that would change their lives completely. Sung-woo was 13 years old when he was apprehended by a policeman when he was on his way back home from school. The boy had some bread left over from his school lunch, but the policeman insisted he had stolen it and went to the extent of burning his genitals to get the truth out of the boy. Traumatized, Sung-woo had falsely admitted to stealing the bread just so he could go back home. However, the admission proved to be disastrous for him, as this was his one-way ticket to Brothers Home. Orphan children were also taken to the center under the guise of being given a chance to enter society as responsible people. Kids like Han and Sung-woo who had families were also forcibly taken away. A network was later uncovered where children were basically kidnapped from the streets and then sold to adoptive parents from other parts of the world, leading to a chain of human trafficking. Brothers Home was responsible for trafficking at least 19 young girls. Mind you, all of this was authorized by the government, which clearly knew what was happening but chose to turn a blind eye. How does the blue uniform symbolize the camp? The people at Brothers Home were made to wear blue uniforms with stripes and forced to sleep in bunk beds in cramped dormitories, much like how the living quarters are portrayed in Squid Game. In the show, the uniforms are the same for all participants, because it emphasizes how everyone in the space is equal and therefore must dress equally. However, the real reason behind having a uniform is to reduce the people to their bare selves and take away their individuality, just like the concentration camps in Europe during the Second World War, where the inmates had to dress a certain way and shave their heads. The inmates at Brothers Home had to dress up in blue striped uniforms, which was a symbol of the oppression that presided over them and took away their voices. The center was also arranged like an army system, with one of the inmates being assigned the position of the platoon leader, who would be in charge of disciplining the rest of the inmates under his command. They were given virtually all powers over their troops, and could use any kind of force necessary to maintain obedience. While this is not something we see in Squid Game, it's interesting how the analogy of having a uniform ensures everyone is equal in the system, while having a disciplinary figure from among the inmates themselves helps direct the rage they have against their own selves. In this manner, the actual perpetrators of the injustice can absolve themselves of the guilt, since they're not directly inflicting any sin on the inmates. Rather, it's the inmates themselves who are doing it. Was rape and torture common at the Brothers Home? Rape and torture were used as tools to ensure there was no insubordination. Sung-woo recalls how he was brutally raped by his platoon leader for 3 nights, in addition to being beaten and having cold water poured over him. When people raised their voices against their treatment, they were beaten till they were dead. Rape was common and happened almost every night. Many inmates have reported how Park In-gun, the director of Brothers Home, had a torture chamber in his office and would regularly take part in tormenting inmates. He was attributed to killing at least 30 inmates himself. The people were also given antipsychotic medications as a form of chemical restraint. The situation was so bad that everyone knew death was just around the corner, and even when they would witness someone being tortured, raped, or even killed, they wouldn't protest out of fear. Did families fight for missing members? Parents of missing kids made every effort possible to find their children and bring them back home. Sung-woo says that his father had gone to the police multiple times and filed a missing persons report, but he was simply not taken seriously by the authorities. However, Mr. Cho was adamant that his children had been kidnapped, and he knocked on the doors of Brothers' home himself and staged a protest. As a result, his children were let out in 1986. This happened amidst rumors that people were being beaten to death inside the so-called welfare home in Busan. We see a parallel of this in Squid Game, when Hwang In-ho's brother infiltrated the games to find out what had happened to him. How did Brothers' home come to light? In 1982, a man named Kang went to the police and asked them to investigate the Brothers' home center for the mistreatment of his brother. However, it appears that the authorities were working closely with the people involved, and Kang himself got jail time for filing a false accusation after Park In-gun stepped in. In 1986, Kim Yong-won, a prosecutor from the prosecution service of Ulsan, led a full-fledged investigation into the happenings in the institution and reported shocking findings. Following this, the then opposition party conducted another independent investigation, which was followed by even more investigations, which revealed instances of sexual violence, forced slavery, arbitrary detention, and other horrific human rights abuses. However, it was largely the work of some 30-odd whistleblowers who systematically led to the discovery of the abuses happening within the walls of Brothers' home. It took a long time to get national attention on the issue, but when the truth came out, it shocked not just the people of South Korea, but also the rest of the world. What legacy does Brothers' home leave? It's been decades following the discovery of the Brothers' home incident, and the survivors are still awaiting justice. Park In-gun was arrested, and the center was closed for good, but the director only got 2 years in jail. That too for embezzlement and corruption. The man passed away in 2016 of natural causes and received no punishment for his crimes. The charges of human rights violations were completely overlooked, much to the plight of the survivors. It's been revealed that Park was deeply connected with the leading government figures who shielded him heavily. There have also been reports that have mentioned his close association with the Protestant Church, which was aware of his activities but never bothered to reveal them to the public. Later, the lead prosecutor of the case confessed that there was immense pressure from the then military government to end the trial quickly and demand a very short sentence for Park In-gun. After this, the prosecutor general also issued a statement asking the Supreme Court to review the judgment, saying that the investigation was deeply flawed. In the last few years, the government of South Korea has expressed wishes to reopen the investigation on Brothers' home in an effort to give closure to the victims. Most of the survivors are left with traumatic memories for life, with many choosing to go to therapy. Reports suggest that most of them received no formal education in life, and at least 1/3 of them are left with lifelong disability. What parallels exist between Squid Game and Brothers' home? Reality is indeed stranger than fiction, because if director Hwang goes to the extent of showing all this on Squid Game, he will probably be blacklisted in the industry. It's true that the more horrific aspects of what happened to the inmates at Brothers' home cannot be adapted for television, but the subliminal messages the show puts forward cannot be ignored. Squid Game shows a world where the ultra-rich use the poor as disposable pieces of entertainment. In Brothers' home, the same policy was followed by Park In-gun, who was rich and connected. The systemic corruption and violation of human rights in both instances are more than obvious. Both instances show the exploitation of vulnerable people and the dehumanization and loss of autonomy through the use of uniforms and living arrangements. The lack of accountability of the people in power who are conducting the abuses is also starkly evident in both cases, since the VIPs in Squid Game operate in secrecy and evade punishment for their crimes, much like Park In-gun in real life. Marvelous verdict. Squid Game draws heavily on the history of economic struggle, authoritarianism, labor rights, and social inequality that has plagued South Korean society for years. While the show has received international acclaim and resonated with audiences all over the globe for its true message, the Brothers' home incident is a less popular counterpart to the fictionalized horrors of the show. For the longest time, the government had tried to keep this incident under wraps, but in recent years, there have been positive efforts on their part to bring closure to the victims. If you liked our content, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to us if you haven't already. Have a good one and be safe. Thanks, everyone.